discoveries. It's in those shared experiences that help build communities. It inspires change, provides opportunities. It brings joy, sparks curiosity. It provokes feelings recognisable to everyone, making our hearts race and giving us goosebumps. It's for those who don't think they can have it. It's for those who know that they need it. It fosters connection and understanding. It is ours for the taking, as well as the sharing. Culture is what makes us human. It makes our world better. Culture is our culture. Let's explore it together.
Since 1785, The Times has been essential reading.
Now, it's essential listening.
Times Radio chooses conversation over confrontation.
Covers Westminster and beyond.
Ask the right questions.
To keep you well informed.
We give words space and let the stories do the talking.
Listen on DAB radio, online, on your smart speaker or via our app.
Like flowers cultivate in cracks in the concrete, culture grows in the spaces between the everyday. It's there in darkened rooms when the stage lights come on. It's in a park full of people belting out the same song. It happens in classrooms, having a go, hands-on. It's found in small circles, exchanging stories. It's under a tent, making brand new discoveries. It's in those shared experiences that help build communities. It inspires change, provides opportunities. It brings joy, sparks curiosity. It provokes feelings recognisable to everyone, making our hearts race and giving us goosebumps. It's for those who don't think they can have it. It's for those who know that they need it. It fosters connection and understanding. It is ours for the taking, as well as the sharing. Culture is what makes us human. It makes our world better. Culture is our culture. Let's explore it together.
Since 1785, The Times has been essential reading.
Now, it's essential listening.
Times Radio chooses conversation over confrontation.
Covers Westminster and beyond.
Ask the right questions.
To keep you well informed.
We give words space and let the stories do the talking.
Listen on DAB radio, online, on your smart speaker or via our app. Since 1785, the Times has been essential reading.
Now, it's essential listening.
Times Radio chooses conversation over confrontation.
Covers Westminster and beyond.
Ask the right questions.
To keep you well informed,
We give words space and let the stories do the talking.
listen on DAB radio, online, on your smart speaker, or via our app.
Like flowers cultivate in cracks in the concrete, culture grows in the spaces between the everyday. It's there in darkened rooms when the stage lights come on. It's in a park full of people belting out the same song. It happens in classrooms, having a go, hands-on. It's found in small circles, exchanging stories. It's under a tent, making brand new discoveries. It's in those shared experiences that help build communities. It inspires change, provides opportunities. It brings joy, sparks curiosity. It provokes feelings recognisable to everyone, making our hearts race and giving us goosebumps. It's for those who don't think they can have it. It's for those who know that they need it. It fosters connection and understanding. It is ours for the taking, as well as the sharing. Culture is what makes us human. It makes our world better. Culture is our culture. Let's explore it together.
Welcome to this production by the Times and the Sunday Times Cheltenham Literature Festival, part of a series celebrating the careers of major world writers as part of the festival's Read the World theme. I'm MJ Franklin, an editor at the New York Times Book Review, and I'm delighted to be at home with Colson Whitehead, the double Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Underground Railroad, The Nickel Boys, and a whole host of other books. So first, I just want to start and say thank you for joining us. It's an honor to be talking to you. Just number one, in 2021, I feel like connecting with new people or reconnecting with people is always a joy. And also, congratulations on this book.
Thanks. You know, it was a nice change of pace. It was very fun, and I'm excited for it to get out into the world. Also excited just to be alive. So if I'm here and you're here, that's like a plus.
So I wanted to start very broad, the most basic of questions, which is, can you tell us what this book, Harlem Shuffle, is about? I like to say, before you have the meal, you got to set the table. So,
well, it's about a lot of different things, but bare bones wise, it's about a fence, and a fence is a criminal who takes stolen goods and sort of washes them, launders them, to put them back in circulation. And so I came up with the idea from watching heist movies and over my lifetime, and hating fences. There's always that moment in a heist movie when they've pulled off the heist, half the crew is dead, they limp in bloody to the fence, and with $2 million in gems, and the fence says, "I'll give you 10 cents on the dollar." And I'm always so appalled, and I hate fences in movies, so I figured it'd be a good protagonist.
Yeah, follow-up question already about that. I like this idea that you're like, heist movies, watch them. The character that I hate, that's where I'm going to start. That's my next book. Can you tell me about how, so after you have this idea, like, where did the story come from? What inspired you beyond just heist movies in general? Why focus on that?
Sure. Well, Sag Harbor is about teenagers growing up in the 1980s, and I hated being a teenager. I hate teenagers. So it seemed like, why not write a book about teenagers? So I'm always trying to work through my problems. Now I love teenagers. Now I love fences. But I gave myself permission to work on a heist novel. Ray Carney, the main character, is a furniture salesman in Harlem in the 60s. And in doing research, a lot of fences have a front organization. They do upholstery, they sell appliances, and in the back is where all the the stolen goods are. So I needed a front, and I decided he'd be a furniture store owner. We'd catch him at the beginning of his career, so he starts off as a small-time fence, and then in the 3 sections of the book, he escalates, rejects, embraces his criminal nature.
And one of the things I loved about this book is that there's this duality to it where you're seeing Ray Carney and you're seeing the come up of Ray Carney, the come up of his business. By the end of the book, no spoilers, like the business is still standing. We'll just leave it there. And then also you're seeing Ray Carney also kind of descend more and more into this kind of like life of crime or life adjacent to crime. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about how you came up with that character of Ray Carney. You have this idea you want to come up with a fence. Tell me more about how you create that and turn that into Ray Carney.
Yeah, I had a situation and I needed a character, and a fence is already living in this liminal space between the crooked world and a straight world. So that became part of his personality. He's descended from a family of criminals. His father was a sort of petty thief, and that's what he grew up watching, the criminal life. But he has these aspirations of entering into the middle class. He's a lovely wife and kids. He's a family man, but he does have this sort of dark nature that he suppresses. He's a cousin, Freddie, who's a sort of ne'er-do-well and always sort of coaxed him into doing the wrong thing, whether they were 10 and it was stealing comic books from the grocery store or throwing firecrackers into a trash can to blow it up. Now he provides Carney with, the odd television set that Carney sells in the corner of his store, stolen piece of jewelry that Carney launders with his contacts. And so I always start with just an idea. It could be a heist, and then where, when. In this case, I was going to write a book in the South, Underground Railroad, and so I knew when I came back I'd want to be in New York. Yep. So what moment in New York history could the robbers exploit? The blackout of '77, the race riots in 1944, 64, and I picked 64 because it was sort of closer to my time. And then once you make that decision, a lot of things flow from that, like what's happening in the city, who's the mayor, where are we in the civil rights struggle, what does someone like Carney, who's a bit older than a lot of the student activists, feel about the rights struggle. So once you sort of plant your flag, you have to, all sorts of things come from that.
And I want to a little bit pan out to kind of like the larger themes and what's orbiting around this book, but I do want to kind of ground readers or watchers of this segment of more details about what the book's about. So can you tell us a little bit about you said there's 3 parts to the book. Can you tell us a little bit about at least the starting part? Where do we find Carney, and can tell us a little bit about his adventures?
Sure. One of the fun things about the book is that I really started to inhabit Carney's world. So at first it was going to be one caper, and then I kept coming up with different jobs for Carney to pull off. And so I conceived of the book as a trilogy of novellas that come together Voltron-like to create a novel. So in 1959, he gets sucked into this heist scheme by his cousin. In the second part, it takes place in 1961, and he's sort of giving into his worst natures in that one. And the third one, it's the 1964 riots. A young black boy has been killed by a white policeman, and Harlem was in flames, Brooklyn was in flames. And I didn't want to exploit the tragedy for the book, so I said it like a week after, and I found that aftermath period interesting. Once the dust has settled and things are getting back to normal, how do you confront what's happened? And so the city is cleaning up after the riot, and Freddie and Carney are cleaning up after a robbery that's gone sort of bad.
And you fill this world in Carney's orbit with a host of other characters with many, many colorful names. There's Pepper, there's Miami Joe. How did you figure out what other people to throw next to Carney?
Well, there's 3 stories, and so, that is going to bring in a much bigger cast. My last book, The Nickel Boys, was very compact, 200 pages with 2 protagonists. And I often choose the next project in reaction to the last one. So the last one was, was very sober and linear, compact. And this one is, sprawling, has a huge cast. And both kinds of books have their different strengths and weaknesses, things that are attractive, things that are more challenging. And so it was a nice antidote to the Nickel Boys. I'd written 2 historical novels where the protagonists were very much controlled by the institutional structures of their time. So slavery and then Jim Crow. So having a character who actually wins in a different way than Cora in Underground Railroad and Elwood and Turner and Nickel Boys was very liberating. And so a lot of the, I had a lot of fun, and I hope that, it was there on the page in terms of the different characters and how they interact with each other.
Yeah, I think it was definitely there on the page. I had a lot of fun reading it, and I felt like I could see you having fun on the page in several instances from, just the fact that Carney wins and like the architecture of all of their adventures, but also in some of like the lines and some of the backstories of the characters you introduce. One of the things that you mentioned, for instance, is there's a small side character, Richard, who you mentioned becomes Ricky, even though he hates that name, just because he's been cursed by this heist, which just felt like a fun joke of, that absolutely happens. That like someone has this identity that they're trying to stake, and then something happens, big or small, like a heist, and it kind of changes everything. And I found myself laughing as a reader, and I felt like, you could see you having fun on the page, which is fun.
Yeah, I think there are moments like that, in Underground than say Nickel Boys, but there's more opportunity here for humor. I that's part of my project, is making weird jokes and absurd humor. There's not really room for that in a story about slavery. Not as much room in the story of a brutal reform school in Florida, the Nickel Boys. And so it was nice to get back to New York. It was nice to get back to be able to make jokes and find an outlet for my weird humor. And definitely, I'm writing a crime novel generations after the first wave. And so you have Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, then in the 50s, say Chester Himes, Patricia Highsmith. I grew up in the 90s reading James Ellroy and Elmore Leonard. Quentin Tarantino comes and does this sort of, ironic crime stuff. And so I'm writing, generations, and there have been so many different iterations and versions and straight versions, ironic versions, that the field was open for a lot of play, and it was very liberating.
And how does that come to bear in terms of the architecture of this book, and in terms of how you thought about Carney's journey and what he goes through?
I do a lot of outlining before I start, and definitely, if you're writing a plot-heavy book, it behooves you to plot it out and to plan it out in advance. And so I did see the 3 years we pick up his story, 1959, 61, 64, as a first act, a second act, and a third act. We meet Carney, are introduced to the world of Harlem and the criminal element. In the second section, we pull back and see some more of the social systems. Class comes into play in terms of Carney wanting to ascend to a more middle-class existence, and what prevents him from doing that. And then in the third section, we pull back even more. So we're not just in Black Harlem, but we're in white New York City as well. And we see the sort of larger power structures that have been sort of working their pressure on Carney and the other characters all along.
And please correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I'm seeing something that like other readers didn't see, but there felt to be this critique throughout the book of who gets sucked into the life of crime and why, who's able to perpetrate what crimes and why, and how does society respond to that, i.e. Carney starting out as a small offense, then you see kind of like white-collar crime in the second section, and then again, you mentioned you pull back. And I was wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about how you were thinking about those themes or those ideas as you were writing this book.
I feel like in the last couple of books I've been dealing with how people get away with things or are not held to account. And so slavery ends, and slave masters aren't arrested or punished for their brutality. They become farmers. They're not slave masters, they're simple farmers now. With the Nickel Boys, we have this brutal reform school, and the guards, the superintendents are committing all sorts of wickedness, and no one's held accountable. They retire with their pension. The kids suffer, but no one is ever called to account. Much like, say, a lot of people in the Trump administration, I felt that a lot of people were going to get away with things. I knew that from the first month, and it was appalling. In this book, the rich and powerful have their ways of getting out of trouble. The street level criminal, not so much. And then where does Carney fit in? We talked about him succeeding. He succeeds at what price? What does he have to do to save his hide?
Yep. And there's a line in this book about strivers and who strives, and I have it written down. You say, plenty of crooks were strivers and plenty of strivers bent the law. And you it comes in this passage you're talking about who's a crook and who's a striver, and how, in the end, strivers bend the law too. Yeah, can you talk to me a little bit about that idea of striving and crooks and striving?
Wanting a better world for yourself. Carney thinks that if he can just get a better apartment for his family, everything will be cured. And of course, in my life, you get the better apartment, and then you see another apartment through the window down the alley. That's even better. So Carney is engaged in that New York struggle for the better place, the better home, the better lifestyle, and as is often the case, it's always just out of reach. So he grew up poor, and he's made something of himself. He put himself through college and grad school, has opened a store, but there's always more. And what prevents him from advancing himself? I'm always sort of pulling back and seeing more. So the sort of more full view. So his wife comes from a very well-to-do family. They're on Strivers Row in Harlem, which is a historically been two blocks in Harlem, with beautiful townhouses built by celebrity architects, and black doctors, lawyers, bankers, live there. And you turn around the corner and you see, sort of dilapidated Harlem, but come onto Strivers Row and you're in a different world. So does he envy that world? Does he despise it? Do the people of that world want him to come in? So there's that, and then there's also, once he starts exploring his criminal side, he starts to see the other city. A corrupt cop takes him around, and as he's taking up his envelopes, all of the kickbacks he picks up every week. And he's like, oh yeah, that bakery shop, that's a front for a craps game. And that stationery store, that's a numbers racket. And so Carney passed by these places all the time for years and years and never knew their secret history. So once you sort of get keyed into the system, you see that, yes, everyone is on the take somehow, or taking an envelope in some way.
And you mentioned this idea of pulling back, and I was wondering, how do you know when you've pulled back enough that you've got the overall picture? And I am especially interested in something like a heist novel, which does have the formula, right? Or the arc. And you mentioned for this book, instead you thought of it as a trilogy that came together like Voltron. How did you know, I've pulled back, I started with my initial heist, I'm going to pull back twice, and now we've got the picture. And how did you map that out? How did you think about?
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot of outlining, and definitely in a book that doesn't have three parts, I do have to know the beginning and the end. And the middle can be fuzzy. The route that the story takes can be fuzzy, but I definitely have to know the destination. So knowing that I'm ending on, I don't want to give it away. So ending in a certain part of New York City. Yep. On the last 3 pages, I know that from before I start, and I'm just mapping out Carney's route to that final moment.
Got it. And I guess I was wondering, so, because this book could easily just be one caper, one adventure, and you end with that destination at the end of the first adventure. How did you know that then, I want more of Carney. I want to see more thematically.
It's, sifting through your ideas and what's viable and what's not viable. Knowing when something's a tangent and when it is actually germane. That's part of editing. But a 300-page heist novel wasn't very compelling. But making it into a character portrait of a time was interesting. And so it becomes less about the crime and the mechanics of the crime and more about Carney. Who is this person and how does he react at all the things that the world throws at him? I kept coming up with different capers for Carney. And so do I want to pursue them? Is it a whim? Is it something that is actually viable? You know, you sit with an idea, and if it stays with you, that sort of argues for it being in the book. I realized halfway through writing the book that I wanted to keep going, and so I'm doing a second book of Carney in the 70s. And so this is him in the 60s, and then New York in the 70s is a very different place. You know, the city's bankrupt, crime's at an all-time high. That's the city I know, you know, from when I was very little. It's very dirty. And so how does Carney react to the changing city? You know, it's a cliche to say, like, the city's almost a character. But the city is changing with Carney as the years go on. And how do all those changes affect how he conducts his life and business?
I have a few things. One, I'm excited to spend more time with Carney. I loved, you mentioned pulling back. I loved getting to pull back, spend more time, and see the character of Carney evolve over the course of the book. And so I'm excited to see him evolve in the next one in the 70s. But then also, I was wondering what anchors you had in this book. Like you've mentioned the city, you've mentioned wanting to tell a heist story, you've mentioned kind of the arc of Carney, but as you came up with this idea of Harlem Shuffle, was there anything that were like, this is my North Star, this is my anchor as I try to figure out what happens?
Well, there's him and what I can achieve by having a character like him. There's what of the heist genre that I want to embrace. You know, for me, it's primarily a film genre. And, you know, in Ocean's 11, you got these handsome stars and they can buy an electromagnetic device and turn off all the casinos' electricity and do their heist. And that's like a high-tech heist. I want like low-tech, you know, people struggling. There's no cell phones. If someone doesn't show up, you'll know where they are, just like the old days. So, so my touchstones were films like The Taking of Pelham 123, you know, early 1970s movie, where some criminals hijack a subway and hold it for ransom. Dog Day Afternoon, very New York movie, New York types, populating it, things go bad. The Outfit, which is based on a Richard Stark book, early 70s. Charlie Varick, another. So basically lo-fi, you know, crime novels. And what I want to take from that genre, what I want to reject. There's a heist story where everything goes to hell, as in Asphalt Jungle and The Killing. We as readers know that the wheelman has been up all night doing heroin, is going to botch the getaway. We as viewers or readers know that the safecracker's wife's been cheating on him. He just found out, and he's pissed, and he's going to, you know, blow the safecracker, blow opening the safe. So the heist goes awry, or they pull it off, and that's like Ocean's 11, or it's one last job. You know, someone's going to retire. So what of that menu do I want to take and then reject? I wanted it to be really grounded in New York. You know, there's a way of doing New York that's allegorical, like The Intuitionist, my first book, and there's a way of doing it where it's very realistic, and the stores are real. They're real places in New York City history. What can I take from what actually happened and serve and put it to service in my book? So, the anti-police riots of '64, the mayoral election of '61. Those are two things.
And can you talk a little bit more about New York, which is extremely present in this book? You joked another character in the book, the star of the book, but like New York is such a presence here, and also in some of your past books too. You mentioned Sag Harbor, for instance, and I was wondering if you talk to me a little bit about writing New York. Let's start with writing New York in this book. You have these touchstones that you wanted to put in the novel. what happens next? How do you write that?
Yeah, I mean, I keep coming back to my hometown. I've gotten, it's defined so much of my personality. I've gotten so much creative inspiration from it. So I have a book about the city called The Colossus of New York. It's a series of essays, very impressionistic. And I feel, and there are actually 2 sentences from that book that are in Harlem Shuffle, as if Colossus is quoting someone in Harlem Shuffle, but that's my own personal system. But I want to, with the main character of Zone 1, who's a suburban kid and heaps all these different ideas about New York City, with Carney, I'm still finding different ways to talk about the city and different structures, different characters. And I guess if I get it right, I'll stop. But I feel I haven't finished the project yet, so I keep going.
Yeah, can you tell me a little more about like what it is about the city that has captured you and illuminates you and like compels you to put it in your writing?
The fact that it's unknowable and I haven't figured it out, so it's a puzzle. But it's so much of my personality that it's worth pursuing.
Because we are recording this a little bit before 9/11. I think this will air a little bit after, and which is to say, I bring this up to say that something that you wrote comes to mind, which was about the Twin Towers falling. I think you wrote that a month after the attacks, and it is such a beautiful meditation on New York and what you can know from New York and what New York can know from you. And so I was personally really excited when I saw that this book, Harlem Shuffle, was going to take place in Harlem.
Yeah, well, I think that essay about 9/11 was my attempt to understand New York, and I'm definitely walking down the street and always superimposing a store that was there 20 years ago over the multiplex that's there now, and I think that's a lot of people's way of seeing a place they love, whether it's New York or a small town. The same way our buried selves are being carried around all the time. So that's definitely what I feel about the city and what I feel about Harlem. There's a secret city that Carney becomes aware of, the criminal city. But even innocent, buildings have their secret histories, and so Harlem starts off as an immigrant neighborhood, German, Italian, Irish, Jewish. They enter the middle class and move to a better neighborhood. Southern Black Americans, Caribbeans come to Harlem to stake their own claim, and so just behind the facade of one Harlem townhouse, you get all these shifting generations, and that's the story of New York, the story of America. So I see that sort of metaphorical slippage between my multiple selves over time and the multiple inhabitants of the city. We're all sort of in it together.
And the reason I brought up that essay too is because I think that keyed me in. I was like, oh my gosh, Colson is one of our great chroniclers of New York, both in fiction and nonfiction. And I wonder how you take that and write it in your fiction authentically. How do you write it authentically without it feeling winking, but without it being too subtle, so that like people don't maybe miss some of the things? Like how do you write about New York and strike that balance?
It's not just New York, but anything you're doing, you're trying to get your private vision there and use language in a way that invites other people in. And so I have a conception of a plantation in Underground Railroad. How do I convey that to the reader? And there's different methods. And so allegory in The Intuitionist, nonfiction in Colossus, and then coming at it realistically and straight on in this book. And all those approaches have their challenges and strengths and weaknesses and drawbacks.
Were there any things that you definitely wanted to add to this book in terms of documenting New York? Of like, oh, I want that building definitely there, or like this type of store needs to be here. Were there any things for you that you put in this book?
I've been asked like, what does Harlem mean to me? And it's really just another place in the city. I don't have any secret history with Harlem. I lived there, for 5 years when I was very young, and we lived all over Manhattan. So for me, it's just another part of the city that I'm exploiting for my work. But in wanting to make it real, I did go to the New York Times archive and just a year's worth of headlines of the New York News in 59 and 61 and 64 to see what I could use. And then that also meant finding real New York places. And so the Hotel Teresa, which is the place that the robbers break into, was a real place. And I never heard of it. And looking back, I guess I'd seen that tall building on 125th Street, but I know its history. But it was the Waldorf of Harlem. And if you're a big celebrity, you're a Billie Holiday, Joe Louis, Cab Calloway, you had to stay at the Hotel Teresa. And on the first floor was a chock full of nuts. And so I was like, oh, I'll put that in. And I remember talking to my mother, like months later, like, I'm writing about Harlem in the 60s and Hotel Teresa, chock full of nuts. And she's like, oh yeah, I ate there every day. It's like she worked around the corner. That was one of her hangouts. I put Blumstein's, which was a big department store. I told my mother a few months after that, and she was like, oh yeah, your dad worked there, for 2 summers, like Carney, which I didn't know. So, in a way, I ended up recreating my parents' 60s Harlem. They were young newlyweds, starting a family at the same time as Carney. They're a little younger than Carney. But recovering all that New York lore is interesting to me. And then as a writer, how do I make it interesting to people who pick up a book?
That's one of the things I loved about this book, which is it is a heist novel, and love a heist story, love a heist novel, love a heist movie. And it's a heist novel and it's really fun, but you do have this history there and it's blended so deftly. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that blending. How do you gesture towards all of this history?
Yeah, I mean,
it's history.
there are many things I found that I didn't put in.
Yep.
They don't fit, and so they go to the cutting room floor. The same way when I was writing Sag Harbor, which was about growing up in the 80s, I had to sift through my own pop cultural history to see what served the book and what didn't. It's not about, here's Colson's nostalgic walk, into the past. It's what can I use that actually happened and put it into service for the main character's story. So, there are things that were cool, but I couldn't fit.
Can you tell us a little bit more about anything that maybe didn't make the book, but you were just really excited about?
Oh, I mean, it's erased from my, I'm not pining.
I tried my best. I tried. For the record, I think I and a lot of readers would very much love to read a Colson's nostalgic tour of New York.
But yeah, I think definitely there is so much of me and how I see the city in the book. So, and I don't have many memories of growing up on Riverside Drive. We moved when I was in kindergarten. But now when I'm with my family, I try to bore them all the time because you always have to go up the West Side Highway. And I'm always like, I used to live there every single time. And they're like, we know. But for me, it's a real magical place and neighborhood. And so hopefully that, affection is in there.
Yeah, it's like, I lived there. It is now a tradition that I will point it out every time. And this is just, this is how it is.
Yeah.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about how Harlem Shuffle fits in your overall body of work. And specifically, you've mentioned Nickel Boys and the Underground Railroad. And I'm wondering how those impacted this book. You mentioned that those were a little bit more compact in terms of the story. And now with Harlem Shuffle, you get to tell a more expansive one. But I'm wondering how did you think about those books? Did you think about those books as you were writing this one?
They're in there. I mean, I think everything I've done before is in the next book. Hopefully I've learned something by writing John Henry Days or Sag Harbor, and I'm putting it, into service with the next book. So, there are definitely things I come back to a lot. They're not always in every book, but the city, the history of race in America, pop culture, humor, satire, and my book of essays about New York doesn't really have a lot about pop culture and race in it. It's just about New York. So these different topics rise and fall, bubble up, disappear, depending on what I'm working on. But I, keep coming back to them. Definitely my affection for pop culture, which means genre. So The Intuitionist, my first book, finds its structure from detective novels. I've written a zombie novel, Zone 1. And now I'm doing a crime story. So I was a shut-in as a kid. I never liked playing outdoors. I just watched TV all day and read comic books. And so whether it's taking all my hours of watching The Twilight Zone and crafting my own version of magic realism with it in, say, Underground Railroad, Cora takes a trip on a train, and then she's suddenly in a Twilight Zone. We're in a very realistic plantation world, and then she takes a wrong turn into the Twilight Zone, basically. So whether I'm doing that or taking these crime movies I watched on Channel 9 and Channel 11 on Saturday afternoons, and then decades later finding inspiration, all that pop culture I consumed as a kid is still with me, and I still have great affection for it.
Yep. Is there anything over the course of your 22 years of writing that you've learned that sticks with you that you're like, oh, I wish I'd known that when I started out?
Sometimes I'll go to a writer's conference and I'm supposed to give my writerly advice, and I'm always like, why are you here? You should be home writing. So shut up and write, just get back to work. I've always I'm easily distracted, and there are periods where I'm goofing off and I'm watching TV and playing video games. But when I'm working, I'm working. So just sit down and write. It's not always about inspiration. Sometimes it's about banging your head against the keyboard and hoping something falls out of your ears. So shut up and work, I guess.
Shut up and work. Good writing advice. Good life advice, just in general. Is there anything that you're just really excited about in this book? Anything that you're like, I can't believe I got to put that in a novel, or I really hope a reader picks up on this?
Well, I'll read an article in the Times or somewhere else. And I'm like, oh, that's a cool idea. There's something I can do with it. And so I have a book about corporate namers called Apex Sides That Hurt, and it came from a magazine article about the naming of Prozac. I was like, oh, that's a weird job. So there are a few things like Dorvay in this book. And I read an article about how in medieval times, before we had electricity, you would do your farming, and then it starts getting dark out, and you go to sleep, and you wake up around midnight for 2 hours. And it was called Dorvay, the watch. Different countries had different names for it. And I was like, one day I'm going to use this. And it seemed to fit Carney's nocturnal activities. It's like midnight to 2 is like prime time, crime time. It's where alcoholics, writers, criminals, and insomniacs convene in isolation when the world's asleep, and you can get a lot done. And definitely when I was younger and less tired, I would have that midnight watch where I would, write some pages and prepare for the next day's work. So I'm finding these little things that intrigue me, and then can I somehow hoodwink readers into thinking it's part of the story, or working very hard to make it part of the story, even if it seems very unlikely. So I look back upon different moments in this book and all the other books too, where like, oh, that was a great day of work, or something clicked in terms of constructing a paragraph, or that's a new kind of image I couldn't have come up with 15 years ago, but I've learned a kind of economy along the way, and I'm putting it to good use. So in the midst of plotting and planning and outlining, and in the midst of the daily, just like putting a paragraph upon a paragraph upon a paragraph, those tiny moments where it's like, oh, this is new, and I couldn't have done it 10 years ago.
I love the phrase prime time to crime time.
It was too corny to put in the book. I was saying that to myself the whole time. I was like, there's no one in this book would use that language. That's
exactly what it was. Like, those things that didn't make it in the book that you're like, I love this. I love this.
So I talked about heist movies, but I got a lot of inspiration from not so much detective novels, because I really cared more about the criminal's point of view, but from people like Richard Stark and Chester Himes and Patricia Highsmith. So Richard Stark was a pseudonym of Donald Westlake, and he wrote 25 books about this Pepper-type figure named Parker. I guess Pepper is a Parker-type figure, but sort of sociopathic criminal, has a code, you know, he doesn't screw up, but other people he works with screw up. And so, you know, if he pulled off everything he wanted to, he'd be like a millionaire, but unfortunately you have to work with these bums, and you know, he doesn't always turn out the way it is. So that's one heist narrative. So hopefully there's some of him, Parker, and Pepper. Patricia Highsmith's portrayal of Ripley, the divided self. And so Ripley, especially in that first book, won't admit to himself his homicidal urges, his queerness. You know, he has all this stuff going on, and he refuses to express it. And so the reader just picks up at, you know, sees what he does and interprets it, but Ripley never processes his actions or the ramifications. And there's definitely some of that denial in Carney. You know, when Freddie, his cousin, calls him a fence, he's like, I sell some used, previously owned material. I'm not a fence. And there was that rejection of his father's lifestyle, but also embracing it. And so, you know, by the middle of the book, you know, his wife has a good job, his business is doing well. He doesn't have to do this, be a fence, but he is. And he refuses to address why he's doing it.
Why do you think he does that? Like, why do you think he continues even if he doesn't have to do it? He doesn't want to admit that he's doing it.
It's his, you know, it's his nature. Why does, you know, I think all of us have these different things we want to do, and then society steps in and says it's actually more productive if we have laws and a code of conduct that we adhere to. And then some people break it. You know, the corrupt, the criminals, the big time criminals, and the petty thieves. But you know, there is that war between one's nature and society, and I think Carney is definitely embroiled in it.
Yep. And we were talking about Pepper a little bit earlier. You said Pepper's a professional, but he has to work with all of these bums. And all of these bums, indeed, because there are several other characters, too. Can you tell me a little bit more about Miami Joe and how you came up with him?
Miami Joe is the mastermind of the first heist. And, you know, I am playing with the traditional structure of the heist, so who's the ringleader, who's the safecracker, who's the wheelman. Everyone has their roles, and so what do I want to take from that tradition? What do I want to throw out? So Miami Joe has his time. There are other pimps, prostitutes, pornographers who come in later, henchmen of various sorts, and they're each an opportunity to build out the world, an opportunity for fun because they're colorful characters, and an opportunity to highlight more of Carney. So Carney hasn't met anyone like Miami Joe since his father died, you know. And how does that change? How does he react, and how does that change our conception of him?
And I want to shift gears a little bit. You mentioned the mastermind, the professional, the new guy, the safecracker. We started this conversation. You mentioned you wanted to write this book because you watched a lot of heist movies, read a lot of heist novels, and you hated the fence. What do you love about heist novels from the opposite perspective? Yeah, what is it like? There's the lure of the big score. And I wrote a book about the World Series of Poker, and I was writing about gambling and what brings them to the poker table. And they believe that, you know, the next hand is going to change their fate. You know, they live these schlubby, terrible lives, but the royal flush coming on the next flop is going to reverse all that. And that's the same thing with heisters and pop culture. You know, if you get this one big score, all the terribleness of your life will be erased. And things go wrong. Things go wrong at the poker table. It's probabilities. It's your own greed, misreading who you're playing with. And things go wrong in the robbery in pop culture because you're working with some clowns or fate is conspired. So both
the gambler and the heister have this dream of reinvention, and if they can just pull it off, they've outwitted fate, outwitted destiny, and written their own sort of future. So there's that hope, and then also there's the meticulousness, planning the heist, the attention to detail. I had to plan a heist for this book because it's in there, and I can't have holes in logic, and so then I plot books, and I have to make even when I'm not writing a crime story, it has to make sense. I have to plot it out, and so I recognize that attention to detail. So perhaps that's there, and I also believe I want those guys in Ocean's 11, to pull it off. I want these petty criminals who are not very nice to like their friends and family, who kill people, who do all these terrible things, but they're, by virtue of the perspective of the book or the movie, are protagonists, and I want them to succeed, even if I wouldn't want to meet them in real life.
I felt that way about all of the characters in this book, and especially Carney, where I was like, Carney, I'm rooting for you. I want you to succeed. I need you to make different choices.
Yeah, that's the magic of the POV character. Yep. You could be a terrible, terrible person, a serial killer like Dexter, Hannibal Lecter, and with the right actor and the right point of view, go to it, Hannibal.
Yep. To that end, would you consider Carney someone like an anti-hero? How do you think of Carney?
Oh, I was thinking about, I think this guy's trying to make a living and a nice home for his family, and I don't judge him.
Yeah, that's for all the watchers, readers, listeners. Don't judge Carney. He's just trying his best, just like all of us.
Yeah.
Did writing this book make you think differently about reinvention? Because as you were speaking, it made me think reinvention comes up in a lot of your books. The characters in Nickel Boys.
Well, I think there's the possibility of reinvention or the hope of reinvention, and then what in society frustrates that ambition. So you have to believe in something, and so in Zone 1, the survivor of the apocalypse has to believe that there's a human refuge, despite all the evidence contrary, or else why go on? Cora, the enslaved person in Underground Railroad, has to believe in this concept of freedom. She's never set foot off the plantation, but it has to be out there somewhere, or else what does she have? And Carney, he comes from very humble origins, and he believes that if he can find someone to love, who love him back, if he can provide for his family, if he can find a nice home for himself, he's made it. So, and he's torn away from. He's fled where he came from. So that's an American story, and it plays out differently in 1870s than it does in 1960s Harlem, but they both are echoes of each other.
So when we first met, it was around when Underground Railroad was coming out. In the intervening years, so much has happened. You've won multiple Pulitzers, you've won a National Book Award, you've become this storyteller that people come to understand these American stories, which is a huge honor, but also there's so much pressure in how you tell those stories. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how do you think about that pressure? It's, again, an honor to tell these stories, but it's an unfair amount of pressure to put on a writer, and I'm wondering how it comes to bear on you and your writing process.
I don't feel any pressure. I think other people's expectations are really other people's expectations. And so my first book talked about race in the city through the lens of the first black female elevator inspector. Yep. Is that what I'm supposed to be doing for my debut novel? Shouldn't I be just doing something more social, something more in the realm of social realism about black life? I was a weirdo from the start. I wrote a zombie novel. Should I be writing a zombie novel as a literary fiction writer? Whatever that means. Frankly, I love the genre and life is short, so I did it. And Underground and Nickel Boys attack the world in a certain sort of way. And it was an honor for me to tell the stories of those folks. I don't feel compelled to do it all the time, and I put enough pressure on myself to fix the sentence, to fix the paragraph. Is this idea working? Am I an idiot? That I don't have room for other people's pressure. So, when I heard about the Nickel Boys winning the Pulitzer last spring, it was the pandemic. We couldn't go to a restaurant, so we had a nice little dinner and some champagne. And the next day, I went back to work to finish Harlem Shuffle. So, what I'm working on now is what motivates me and what I'm consumed with, and not screwing it up. I spend half my time just saying, like, don't screw it up, Coulson. So that's enough pressure apart without strangers telling me what to do.
Amazing. Back to work. That's all we all can do. That's what we got. That's what we got. Thank you for watching. You can buy copies of the books discussed via the online bookshop, details of which will be appearing on your screen shortly. Thank you for joining us, and we're very grateful to Coulson for the rich insight into his writing life. Thank you again, Coulson, and thank you for joining us.
It's never been more vital to be thinking and reading broadly, and we want our festival, the first and oldest literature festival in the world, no less, to be your passport to a world of ideas.
It's just wonderful to be here in person and, with three-dimensional people.
I'm really excited. Yeah, really, we've been coming for a number of years now. Missed doing it face to face last year, so it's amazing. Love it.
Super happy to be back.
Yeah.
Kia ora tātou, kua Anne O'Brien toku ingoa, hei kaurungi a hau ki Waituhi o Tamaki, no mai, haere mai. Welcome, I'm Anne O'Brien, I'm the director of the Auckland Writers Festival, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce today one of the rising stars of the New Zealand literary scene. Ruby Solly is a writer, a poet. Her debut collection, Tōku Papa, was published earlier this year, and I urge you to get a copy of that and just immerse yourself in those wonderful poems. She's also a composer and a musician, and this year she was the curator Māori for the Auckland Writers Festival. Speaking with her today is Hemi Kelly. Hemi is a board member of the Auckland Writers Festival. He is a published author in his own right, a te reo Māori teacher and translator, and one of his latest projects has been to work with Lorde, taking 5 songs from her new album Solar, translating them into te reo Māori. I'd like to hand over now to Hemi and Ruby.
Kia ora, and tēnā koe. Ruby, tēnā koe, kia ora.
Kia ora. How are you this morning?
I'm good. I'm sitting here in a big Wellington storm, hoping the sound doesn't creep through, but also quite enjoying being inside today.
It hasn't reached us yet in Auckland. Hopefully, it doesn't come too far up the country. Hey, e hoa, I'm sitting here with your book, Tōku Papa. Firstly, I just want to congratulate you and also thank you on sharing this collection of poems inspired by your papa, who I want to acknowledge. What's the journey that Tōku Papa has taken?
Aira, Tōku Papa for me started, I think it really started when I was a small child, being raised by both my parents. But a lot of my Māoritanga, a lot of what makes me Māori, coming from my relationship with my father and his relationship, which then became my relationship with the land and with all of these things that make us Māori. So in terms of the almost research for the book, my whole life really, and even his life before that, and the book looks a lot at how our parents and their parents and their parents and all these ways of being have been passed down over a long time and how that creates a culture. But in terms of the book, I first started writing a smaller manuscript called Tōku Papa for a paper at the Institute of Modern Letters at Vic Uni with Tina Makariti about 3 or 4 years ago now. And then by the end of that course, I had a third of the book. And then another third was written on a residency with Starling. It's a youth literary journal here. And then after that, I fleshed it out with the last few pieces. But being a first book, it came together really easily. And I think because of kind of memory digging and walking back into the mind to find all of those moments that are quite pivotal in a young person's life with their parents.
Yeah, I noticed as I'm reading through the poems, there's this reoccurring theme that speaks to connection to memory, to place, to people, to relationships, that connection between past, the present, and then following on into the future. When you're writing, are you conscious of that theme that reoccurs?
Yeah, I think I was really conscious of that theme. There's definitely, and I think it's a New Zealand kind of arts trope in a way, but it's one that we do really well, where these really significant big events are happening to characters, but they can kind of look at it in quite a detached way. There's this real bird's eye view sense within a lot of our films and our writing. And I've really felt that through the text. It will be, a really pivotal tohu dream, like a dream that shows us signs of what we should or shouldn't be doing or what will happen anyway. And there's this kind of detachedness from it while still being intrinsically woven with these people and with these happenings. And yeah, so I think that comes through really strongly in the text.
Yeah. With connection to place and writing about place, why do you think we as Māori, that's a key feature of our writing?
That's a really interesting question. I think because we have this concept of whakapapa, and not just in terms of genealogy, but in terms of a big interwoven kind of whariki in a way that can connect us to all things. Like how you and I were talking about how we both went to country schools within the same area and we both went to the same sports days and we both know what growing up in those circumstances looks like. And that's going to look different to somebody who grew up away from that, though they will be able to connect in another way. And I think that makes us really strong writers and really strong orators. But as well with the connection to place, I think, we have tūraka waiwai or tūranga waiwai, knowing a place where we're allowed to stand. And still today, there are a lot of places where we may feel that we aren't able to stand or hold that space because of various factors. And I think in the book as well, that's part of that detached side of it, was that I grew up away from our tribal areas outside of our takiwa. And so a lot of my experiences with nature were with the wider concepts of atua and kaitiakitanga and things like that, rather than having the whakapapa connection to those places. So when that started to come in, when I was a bit older and able to kind of afford to investigate that, because a lot of Māori can't, it was kind of all these things I've been taught my whole life were ready for me to be able to be in those landscapes and see that I whakapapa back to Aoraki and I whakapapa to the Waitaki Valley and to understand how those things worked.
Kia ora. Before we carry on with our kōrero, with our discussion, Ruby, I was hoping maybe you'd read a piece from the book.
I will. I'll read Te Whare o Hoane. On the first day, Hoane pushed Rakinui away from Papatuanuku and let the light settle like debris after a storm. This will be our new land. On the second day, Hoane pulled trees from the ground. Karakia echoed through the forests. Rakinui wept rivers onto volcanic sands. A simple house is all we need, easy to eat, heat, and you always know where all the tamariki are. On the third day, Hoane replenished the forest. Soft earth gave way to strong hands. New roots burrowed down towards the earth's inner heat. When we take, we give in turn. It hurts to take, but it hurts us all to perish. On the fourth day, Hoane searched for food. He pressed sunburnt ears to the ground and he listened. He lay on the forest floor and the riverbed and he heard them breathing. There is fish, fruit, and water. We will always be full as long as we give back what we take. On the fifth day, Hoane invited the animals into his paradise. The sky vibrated with the migration of birds. The ground shook as all the animals ran in to meet him. He stood in the centre of the land, arms raised, conducting them all. We are all equal, and this will be home to us all. On the sixth day, Hoane provided for his whānau. He fed them from the forest, he fed them from the rivers, and he kept them warm in his home. The life from the land flows into us all. We nurture each other, we leave no footprints. On the seventh day, and all the days thereafter, Hoane rested, as the lands around him overgrew, and the house in which he lived was reclaimed by the land. Let us build no fences, so that all the land we see is ours.
Kia ora. Tēnā koe. In your poems, not only this poem, you use a lot of te reo Māori, the Māori language. And I'm just aware of those people listening in who might not be familiar with the language. But there's also reference there to our narratives and our customs. In that poem in particular, I see this, I don't know if it's a pull and tug, but there's these two narratives sitting parallel, the narrative of our creation story as Māori and then the Christian creation story. But then there's references to your father there, who I'm assuming is Hoani. Could you explain a little bit?
Yeah, so I think within that, it's looking at, within time and te Māorian concepts, we often have, there's like a recapitulation almost of different pūrākau within our own lives. So that was me kind of looking at my dad suddenly having all of this energy to create this environment, the perfect environment to bring up children, and him working to do that, and this sudden burst of knowledge and understanding and desire for that. And kind of when you're a child, you see your parents as being like gods and having the same power as gods in a way. And I was kind of seeing him being that same person, as, you know, him being as large as Rangi and Papa, our primordial parents, and how that could be, and how that scale looked to a child. And then you can kind of tell that through the poem, the narrator's kind of growing a bit wiser about what's happening. And there's this, once it's all been created, it just kind of slowly kind of falls apart. And I think that's a really interesting thing too, because we so often think of parents as being so perfect that when we realize they're not, it kind of starts to fall apart for us as well. And it can be thought of similar ways of some of our pūrākau, I think, and it can be thought of the same way for Christianity, which was mixed with our pūrākau to make it more palatable for us, and how that can look.
Mm-hmm. Māori, us here in New Zealand, we're grouped tribally, and you're talking about pūrākau, our stories. They differ from tribe to tribe, but we do share some stories. The Ngaitahu stories vary quite a lot, though, if we look to. And I notice you use some of your writing here to not only share the dialect, but also some of those narratives. How do the Ngaitahu narratives differ, and how do you use your writing to share those stories with other Ngaitahu?
Yeah, I think a lot of our narratives are more hidden because there was a lot of desire, and I think there still is, to kind of share a cohesive narrative that everybody can understand or can say this is the way. But a lot of our narratives were kept kind of away from that. So we have Rakinui and Papatuanuku both have ex-partners, and our and in the creation story for us, in the beginning is a song. So there's a darkness when we have a sandbank around the world, and the world's flat in Kaitahu mythology, and all these different wind gods on the banks, and then the world is kind of brought into being by this song. And yeah, so they're just such beautiful stories that we have that do really differ from the rest of the country. So I always try to put little parts of those within texts. I like to think of them as Easter eggs for Kaitahu readers. So I always try to put in as many Easter eggs as I can. And it might be the kind of thing where someone who's a Kaitahu reader who hasn't come across that knowledge yet might not realize what they're reading, but later on when they hear it again, they can think, oh, I already knew that from reading that book and I didn't realize. And that's kind of my goal with doing that, to give people that knowledge back, not in a really confronting way, but in a kind of passive and meditative way. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I did notice that you did dedicate this book to all the little snotty-nosed Kaitahu girls out there.
Yeah, I'm still one of those. And yeah, there were quite a few at the launch as well. It was great reading that and looking out and seeing all these little cousins like, it's like, oh, hello. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the book has been described as, it can serve as a map of survival for Māori growing up outside of our tribal areas, and that's so many of us. How do you hope that your work will impact Māori who are growing up outside of their areas, who share those similar experiences, but Ngaitahu in particular?
I think that when we're trying to reconnect with our Māoritanga, there's often a lack of empathy. I think there can be a lack of empathy and a lack of understanding. And when you've grown up with something your whole life, sometimes you don't realize how precious it is. And I think that this book has a lot of empathy for those people. And for me, it was kind of a journey of self-compassion and realizing that actually, if you didn't grow up with video, if you didn't grow up knowing those things in your early 20s, that's actually not your fault. There's not much you could have done. You don't have a lot of power. But I think that through books, there is a lot of power. And I would read Kerry Holm, Hini Baker, and other Kaitahu authors, and that would give me a really strong sense of identity, or if not a strong sense of identity, a strong sense of other people who were also growing up outside of those environments for things that were no fault of their own. So I think having that within those books is a really, that's the map for survival, and survival being a key word there. That's kind of like at least a holding for now until you're able to enter into that space on your own terms.
Kia ora. This map is organised into two separate categories. That's awe and kura in the book. Two chapters, I suppose. What do the awe and the kura represent?
Right. So I'm a big bird nerd. I think most New Zealanders are bird nerds. That's kind of just a country thing. But in my whānau, we have lots of names pertaining to birds that have been passed down. So tieke, which is a saddleback, and koko, which is the southern name for the ruru, or the name for the sound as well. And so having lots of feather and bird-based kōrero was something that I really wanted to have in there. So awe or as well, so kind of trying to do the old double word, can pertain to the down under the wings, like the softest fluff. But it's also in some places, and I'm trying to get a few better sources on this, was said to be the kind of distillment of the soul. And yeah, so it's that kind of fine, distilled, precious, small. And then kura is kind of the red feathers and something precious. And yeah, and all the connotations that come with red, I think, in any culture in terms of, I guess, blood and pain, but also things that are precious. And yeah, and there's a sense of urgency to that. Yeah.
Kia ora. Speaking of manu being bird, I heard you perform 6 for a single, 8 feet for a double, and you incorporate or weave into that poem this Ngai Tahu song, Manu Tiria. Are you continually inspired by our metaphor, our proverbs, our ways of speaking in Māori?
Definitely. I'm really inspired by that, and I think that so often if you translate like something from Māori directly into English, in my kind of humble, not that great way of doing it, but it always reads like poetry, or even like Shakespeare in a way. Like I remember being there with cousins and we're translating something and be like, this is just Shakespeare, like it just feels exactly the same in terms of the metaphor and the rhythm and the way it's said. It's, but it's ours. And yeah, so I'm definitely really conscious of that in those older texts. And I think kind of being able to tell one story above and tell another story below for audiences is it's something that many minority writers have developed, not as a coping mechanism, but as a way of kind of coding some of our more precious matauraka, our more precious knowledge and experiences, so they can be within text for our people, while people who may not have those experiences, which is fine, can read what's happening on the top and also be receiving, a beautiful story that takes them through these places they want to go to, and, the wording, and they're still getting the whole picture, but those people are getting something that they need as well. And I think a lot of, really, I think that's the aim for a lot of Indigenous writers, possibly. It definitely is for me.
Kia ora. Kia ora, Ruby. Thank you for carrying on this tradition of Māori poetry. Thank you for publishing this beautiful book and sharing these stories. Tēnā koe.
Kia ora hoa. Thanks so much for the chat.
No mai haere mai. My name's Rachel King and I'm the Program Co-Director of Word Christchurch, which is a 5-day festival of books, storytelling and ideas, usually held in August. Unfortunately, this year our festival was postponed due to a COVID outbreak and is now going to be taking place in November. It's such a huge pleasure to be here, and I just want to say a huge thank you to Lindsay from the Cheltenham Festival for inviting us, and I'm really excited to be introducing the work of Mohammed Hassan to you. I also want to thank Creative New Zealand for supporting this event. So Mohammed Hassan is a journalist and a poet from Auckland and Cairo. He was the 2015 New Zealand National Poetry Slam champion and has toured his work internationally. His poems have been widely shared online, notably the beautifully filmed Unlearning My Name, and they've been taught in hundreds of schools. In 2017, he was awarded the Gold Trophy at the New York Radio Awards for his RNZ podcast series Public Enemy, which covered Islamophobia and counterterrorism. His most recent series, The Guest House, tackles community grief following the Christchurch attacks. His latest collection of poems, National Anthem, is published in New Zealand by Dead Bird Books, explores themes of displacement, nationalism and mental health. Now, I first met Mohammed when he performed at the 2016 Word Christchurch Festival, and I didn't know much about him at that point, except that his poems had a quiet power to them, and that New Zealand festivals had been missing the voice of someone with his experiences. After that, I took notice of what he was doing as a journalist, and his was an essential voice in reporting on the Christchurch mosque attacks of 2019, which floored our city and our country. I invited him to the festival last year to launch National Anthem and to speak on our gala night, Brave Worlds, where 6 writers explored the theme of courage. It was later broadcast on Radio New Zealand and it can be found online. Kia ora, Mohammed.
Kia ora, Rachel. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So you're in London now. We've lost you.
For the time being, yes. But, everybody is in lockdown. We're all distanced and separated and connecting in on these new ways. So I might as well be in New Zealand right now.
Well, this is true, isn't it? Yeah, the wonders of technology bringing us together. Now, you're not from Christchurch, but you're doing what I think is some of the most important writing that's actually ever come out of Christchurch. So this is why I wanted to. This is why I guess I chose you, I suppose, as our writer that best represents what Word Christchurch is doing at the moment, I think. So I think maybe first we can talk about your poetry, because that was where you did first come to my attention. So I'm just wondering if the poetry that you did back in 2015 opened doors for you professionally in your other work as well.
As a journalist and as a poet, I think both of these worlds often kind of converge and then diverge in different ways. I think there was a convergence at that time when I was writing a lot about what it was like, the experience of being a Muslim in the world, in the post September 11 world, specifically over the last 20 years. And at the time in New Zealand, there were a lot of very sweeping counter-terror legislations that were being introduced. Of course, there was the phenomena of ISIS that was taking place on our screens and everybody was watching it. All of that was having an impact on what it was like being a Muslim in New Zealand and other parts around the world. And through my work in journalism, I was able to kind of speak to people and try and elevate the voices of people in the community. But through my writing as a poet, I try to take a more personal lens in speaking about these issues. And so I was talking about what it meant to try and find your identity in this often very charged world, but also other spaces that you find yourself in that were equally charged, like airport terminals, for example. And it's kind of it's almost like a running joke in Muslim circles that in any space that you go to in an airport, you're going to be pulled over, or even if you're not pulled aside, you're constantly thinking about being pulled aside and very conscious of the fact that your identity is politicized. And I think that is probably a common theme across a lot of the work that I've done, is the idea of how identities can become politicized in our current state of affairs.
So how did you start with the journalism and reporting on Islamophobia in New Zealand?
So it began when I started working at RNZ as a reporter, and there were a lot of stories that were coming through the Muslim community that I was aware of and that I really believed needed to be heard. And for a long time, I think as a journalist specifically, I was very sensitive of just how damaging some of the narratives are about Muslims, about the Muslim community that existed in the media, that existed in the news specifically. And I really felt a responsibility and urge to try and counter those narratives by bringing forward voices from the Muslim community. In New Zealand, for example, for the longest time, people would only hear about Muslims and the Muslim community when it was coming from overseas news, when it was coming from those stories of happening in Syria or Paris or Istanbul. And yet people had very, very little, if any, interaction with the Muslim community. And what we saw in the last few years after Christchurch is this influx of all of these amazing voices from the community that they've been there, but have never found platforms to speak. And I think people in New Zealand have really gotten to know some of these people and gotten to know this community in a much more intimate way. And I think through my work, I've always aspired to try and do that and to bring those voices forward, because I thought that was sorely missing in the way that we were able to talk as a country.
I'm just thinking too about the work of people like Anjum Rahman from the Islamic Women's Council, and how before the 2019 attack, she was trying to, raise awareness of the dangers that were out there for the way Muslims are being treated. Do you feel that your work that you were doing with Radio New Zealand was had some of that in the back of your mind while you were doing that?
Absolutely, and Anjum was one of the people that I spoke to when I did my podcast Public Enemy in 2016, and that was also, it was happening 15 years after the anniversary of September 11. It was happening in the run up to the U.S. elections, which ultimately Donald Trump won on a platform that included very much at the center of it a ban on Muslim immigration, an attack against ISIS, and so all of this stuff was kind of coming to the forefront again in a lot of Muslim people's lives. And so what I tried to do with that podcast was to interview Muslims, not only in New Zealand but in the United States and in Australia, in three places where counterterrorism and Islamophobia were very charged. And really impacted the lives of Muslims. And I got a lot of very similar stories from these three places. And in New Zealand, it was the work of people like Anjum Rahman, who for years was tirelessly advocating on behalf of Muslims in a lot of government spaces and with security, with the police, with SIS, with all of these kind of intelligence agencies, and really not being listened to or not really being taken seriously for a very long time. And of course, more recently, I think people have started recognizing how essential a voice like Anjum, like other people in the communities are, and why they need to be given platforms and to be listened to.
Mm-hmm. So the March 15 attack was, a defining moment in our country's history and in the history of our city. I find it really interesting, actually, that when people talk about the mosque attack, people who don't live in Christchurch just refer to it as Christchurch. So they talk about, you talk about it in your podcast before Christchurch and after Christchurch. So it's interesting for people who live in Christchurch to have the name of their city now become synonymous with this horrific attack. And I wondered, do you think it's a defining moment in Christchurch's history? Do you think we will always, this will always be tainting what happens in the city from now on, or do you think we can come together and move past it?
I think in the aftermath of any kind of society-defining event, it's really the story that the people living in that city are able to mold and reshape and to turn into something that's different. And before the mosque attacks, when people talked about Christchurch, at least in New Zealand, it was always in reference to the earthquakes. And I know people in Christchurch kind of get sick of hearing about that story, but it was this idea that this kind of life-altering event that changed the whole country, but specifically changed the city. And it was in the aftermath of it that people in Christchurch and Cantabrians were able to start rebuilding what that story, what that narrative of that city looked like and what it could look like. And I think in the aftermath of the mosque attacks, it's the very same kind of challenge. It's about how a community, how a city and a society is able to rebuild and rewrite. And I'm a very strong believer that, as tragic as any event could be, it is often an opportunity to start fresh and to rebuild and to rewrite and reimagine. And there's a lot of hope and optimism in that rebuilding phase. And I think it's I think a lot of that work is starting to be done not only in Christchurch but across the country, and it's very essential work. And it's allowing us to address some of the demons of the past that maybe we've been too uncomfortable to talk about previously.
Definitely. And you bring up the Christchurch earthquake. And so for people who are watching who don't know about Christchurch, it's a very colonial city. It's talked about as being kind of the most English city in Christchurch. Outwardly, it was always very white. The dominating culture was Pākehā. It was from the English settlers. But after the earthquakes, it kind of razed a lot of that to the ground. I mean, literally 70% of the CBD was demolished after the quakes. And as someone who is not from here but who lived here, I found that Christchurch was a much more interesting place to live after the quakes. People were a lot friendlier. Suddenly we were seeing a much more diverse range of cultures who actually not only lived in Christchurch but who were visible in Christchurch as well. So yeah, for something like the mosque attack to happen here, it was devastating on so many levels. And I wanted to ask you too, because in your podcast work and in your journalism that you've done for The Guardian and other places like that, you talked about about how you were overseas when the attack happened. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I was working in Istanbul at the time, on March 15th specifically. And, I mean, it had just happened to be 2 weeks after I'd come back from visiting my family in Auckland. So I'd just been in New Zealand and I'd just returned. And then I woke up to essentially what was the aftermath of the attack. And receiving messages from everybody I knew, asking me, was my family okay? Did I hear about what happened in Christchurch? And of course, given the context that you just said, my first thought was that there was another earthquake that happened in Christchurch. That was the first thing that came to my mind. The furthest thing that could have possibly occurred to me at that time was that there was a terrorist attack, and that this would have happened, at the center, at the heart of this Muslim community on Friday when people were at the mosque worshiping in their hundreds. It was it's one of those days that I think defined a lot of people's lives that I know. We have such a small Muslim community in New Zealand. There's only 40,000 of us across the country. There's only about 3,000 Muslims in Christchurch specifically. And it's this kind of situation where if you didn't know a person that died in that mosque attack, then you knew somebody that was at the mosque. And I know I have a lot of friends that lost loved ones in that mosque, and I have friends that were at the mosque themselves and saw things firsthand. And so the epicenter, if you will, feels so close to so many people and so many families. And in the aftermath of it, it really kind of it forced every Muslim in New Zealand to really kind of think about their identity and what that meant. For me, it was, being flown back by my employer, thankfully, so I could go cover the events. And I really wanted to be as close to Christchurch as humanly possible so that I could grieve with my community. And not really kind of, the distance became very apparent. I spoke to my mother and my sister who don't live in Christchurch, who live in Auckland that day, and I found myself being really overwhelmed by the thought that I was so distant and so far away from them and unable to do anything to protect them in any kind of incident. And I think in those situations, it really hits home how much your distance from home can mean and how significant it can be. But thankfully, I was able to go back and spend some time in Christchurch in the days following the attack and really spend time with the Muslim community as they grieved and as people buried the dead and as people came together and prayed. And it was a moment when you realize what it meant to have a community and what that meant for people coming together and trying to lend a hand as much as possible. But it was also, thankfully, it was an opportunity for me to be in New Zealand while the country itself came to grips with what had happened and grieved collectively. And in the days that followed, I think has really impacted everybody in the country and really changed us as a country, but it also gave us a glimpse into what we could be as a country. And I think the whole world really was watching us do that, and it was really significant.
You also talk about the fact you were there as what you call a professional witness as well. And so could you just talk a little bit about the fact that your professional and personal worlds were colliding with such emotion at that time?
Yeah, I mean, the tricky thing about covering the Muslim community and Islamophobia and counterterrorism, as I do, is that oftentimes I feel like my personal and my professional worlds are colliding in a lot of ways that are often kind of difficult to separate and difficult to kind of distinguish where that line is. But covering the Christchurch attack was really put that to the test, because I became very aware of the fact that I was just in some instances, I was just another person with a camera among a sea of people from all around the world with cameras that were all trying to get the same stories out of the same people and trying to get really these horrific instances of grief, and to be able to essentially, I mean, we were there to do our work in the simplest way possible, and that work was to talk to people that had lost loved ones and get their stories out of them. And as somebody who often has to do that in other contexts, there is a certain professional distance that you put between yourself and your work, sometimes to be able to get you to do to do that kind of work and to absorb the heaviness of it. And that kind of professional detachment is often a tool that helps you kind of cope, but also helps you to do your work in a good way. But in Christchurch, it was impossible. It was impossible to put any kind of distance between me and people who I knew personally, and to try and really justify what I was able to do in that space that was different to what a CNN reporter or a BBC reporter or an Al Jazeera reporter was doing in that space as well. And I think there was a lot of times when I felt like I was really uncomfortable, and really kind of forcing people to talk about things. But instead, I really shifted my attention, and the resolution that I found in myself to do that was that I wasn't going to spend most of my time talking to the families themselves, but I was going to talk to government officials, and I was going to talk to activists and advocates and voices like Anjum Rahman and Guled Meyer and Faisal Assad, and then to call up the head of police, and to call up the commissioner, and to talk to all these people about what was happening behind the scenes, and the failures of what had happened, and so that to me was the way that I could do this job in a way that felt constructive, and in a way that felt like I wasn't almost betraying the community and these people that knew me very personally by trying to get these stories out of them when so many other people around me were doing just that.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, and we can get onto your podcast, The Guest House, in a moment, but I wonder if your poetry and those two things as well.
Writing is an outlet for a lot of people that kind of are drawn to it, and for me, definitely poetry in many ways was kind of the catharsis that I needed in order to be able to let out those parts of myself that I had to restrain when I was doing my journalism work, and that I have a lot of thoughts and emotions about, and I find that with poetry, it's a way for me to be able to express that without necessarily feeling like I have restraints around what I can and can't say, and around the need to be objective. With poetry, it does not ask objectivity of me. It's quite the opposite. It's a subjective form, and it needs to be a subjective form, because I need to be able to really use it to talk about all of the things that are happening inside. And sometimes a lot of that is chaos, and sometimes it's a lot of confusion and complexity. And through poetry, I'm able to unpack a lot of these things and pull up the threads out and look at them in the light. And so I think it will be very difficult for me to be able to operate as a journalist in these spaces without having an outlet that I can then use to speak to some of the emotional aspects of the things that I'm passionate about writing about.
Yeah. I wonder if you could maybe do a short reading from the poem The Guest House.
Yeah. I actually wrote this poem during the process of doing the podcast, The Guest House, which was about Christchurch and about the grieving process that the Muslim community had to go through after the attack, and in all of its kind of myriad ways. But it was a poem that I wrote, and I dedicated it to the two mosques, Al Nur and Linwood. In this house we have one rule: bring only what you want to leave behind. We open doors with both hands, passing batons from death to life. Come share with us this tiny piece. We built from broken tongues and one-way boarding passes, from kauri bark and scholarships, from kaitiaki and kin. In this house we are all broken, all strange, all guests. We are holding space for you, stranger, friend. So come angry, come dazed, come hand against your frail, open wounded, heart between your knees, sick and sleepless, come seeking shelter, crawling in your lungs, teeth inside your grief, come shattered peace, come foreign doubt, come unrequited sun, come shaken soil, unbearable canyon, desperately alone, untuned blossom, wild and hollow prayer, come celestial martyr, come singing doubt, come swimming to land, come weep, come whisper, come howl into embrace, come find a new thread, a gentle light, a glass jar to hold your dust, come closer, come in, you are welcome, brother.
Thank you, Mohammed. And one of the things that's most notable and poignant about that poem, of course, is the last line, which is "You are welcome, brother," which one of the worshippers actually said to the shooter as he came into the mosque. That's right.
Yeah, and I thought about that last line because I realized that, you know, as soon as you say the word brother, in out of context, it becomes a limiting thing, because obviously if you don't kind of relate to that or connect to that, or that it might kind of be a distance. But I did feel like it was a reference point that I think a lot of people really held on to, and those words, you know, that were said to the shooter by that worshiper, "Hello, brother," at the entrance of the mosque, became really symbolic in the aftermath of the mosque attacks, and they were echoed across the world. There was a hashtag at some point. People were making pictures and murals out of them. It was something that it was this heartbreakingly small token of beauty that's in the midst of this archaic kind of an event that was important for people to hold on to, because I think in times like this, it's the beauty and the kindness and the peace that that people flock to, and trying to come to terms with things that have happened and trying to make sense of them, but also in terms of, you know, trying to process and to trying to come together and grieve.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all we've got time for, so I think that's a really, really important note to end on. For anyone who's interested, the Guest House is an incredible podcast that Mohammed has put together, and each episode is based around the 5 stages of grief, which is quite a brilliant structure, I think. And so, yes, thank you so much, Mohammed. It's been short, but it's been great to see your face again. And yeah, I just hope that everybody can get out and check out Mohammed's work. Deadbird Books has published his book National Anthem, and I would hope that it would be available to purchase online as well. So thank you very much.
Kia ora, Rachel. Thank you very much for your time and for that beautiful conversation.
E aku nui I aku rahi tēnā koutou katoa, ko Claire Maybe toku ingoa, ko ahau te pautuhituhi ki verb pōneki tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody, my name is Claire Maybe and I am the director of Verb Wellington, and I'm delighted to be speaking with one of our great writers, Elizabeth Knox, the author of 13 novels, 3 novellas and a book of essays. Elizabeth won the Prime Minister's Award for Fiction in 2019, and her latest novel, described by The Guardian as an instant classic, is The Absolute Book, which is a truly astonishing piece of work. So Elizabeth, I wanted to start off by saying that I've heard that you found your way into this epic story through your interest in a genre that you call the arcane thriller, which is a genre of detective fantasy. And I wonder if you could speak on that a little more. Tell us what that is.
Well, I had known for some time that I wanted to write a large, an epic novel in terms of it moving across a lot of space and encompassing in its implications quite a lot of time and history. But I didn't have a way in. I didn't have a sort of an organising principle. And when you're writing something that has a lot of scope, it is quite good to have something to be looking for. But I'd wanted to write a book that felt like Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, and that it was dramatic and moving, but also antic and silly and grand and beautiful and eerie, and like just something that kind of could encompass all those tones. And then, of course, that book is part of its story is organised around a burned manuscript by the master, who's a novelist, who's in a fit of despair burned a novel that keeps getting rejected by the sort of people who make decisions in Russia about literature in the 1920s, and he attracts the attention of the devil and the devil's minions as champions. So I just thought to myself, well, yes, I love that book, a book around a book. And then I started thinking about Dan Brown and Kate Moss and a number of other writers, and I was having a discussion with a friend of mine, and we both came up with this term, arcane thriller, which is basically a story where there's a scholarly hero looking for something. So that was a way into a book that had a lot going on with it and had the supernatural in it. But it's a quest narrative, but quite focused. And I did like the idea of having a scholarly hero.
It so brilliantly does evoke all of those things. I've read the book twice now, and I want to read it again. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that tonal variation in the novel, particularly on the comedy. And I wondered if you could tell us what kind of comedy you draw on to create that tone.
I do like situational comedy, and the comedy in the book is usually sort of inexplicable. Something that one of the point of view characters, who are a police detective and the scholarly hero Taryn, can't explain and is happening, and they're trying always to keep ahead of people who will stop them from continuing down the path of their investigation. And the situations they get in are, they're sort of forms of near revelation that involve embarrassment. So yeah, I've always liked those kind of scenes where the supernatural element is kind of flaunting its supernaturalness in front of people who don't know about the supernatural, and the person who does know about the supernatural is trying to do damage control in order to maintain secrecy, not because they're responsible for secrecy, but because they just want to keep doing what they're doing with as little interference as possible. So a lot of it's that, and then some of it is related. Like, one of my favourite things in the book is where the Odin's ravens are trying to question a demon, and they can't get Odin to help them, so they get the heroine's father, who is a very imposing character actor, to act Odin, and he thinks he's doing a screen test, but actually he's talking to a real demon, and the animatronic ravens in the scene are actually Odin's real ravens, and it's all, and you hear the story from his point of view, so it's yeah.
I love that bit, and there's also such a great New Zealand in-joke in that character as well, which I love. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the character Shift, who's one of the most compelling characters ever, maybe. And to me, he almost read as an embodiment of the act of writing itself. And I wondered if that's correct, and how you came up with this interesting, shape-shifting non-human.
So Shift is a later in history version of a particular person in English stories or folklore, who's the story that everyone knows about that character has become relatively irrelevant to him, so he doesn't foreground it and he tries to avoid talking about it, and he wants to operate as the person people meet and see. But he's under a spell which conceals many things about him. I mean, it's not his spell, and it's been on him since he was 8 years old, and he gets misinterpreted and underestimated is how the spell works. And he is also part of the spell, or part of the way the spell has worked has meant that he also loses his memory every 200 years. So he's long-lived. And when he loses his memory, he keeps his procedural memory, so he still knows how to birth a baby or ride a horse, but he doesn't know his story. So he has gathered friends throughout the years and kept them in fairyland where they'll live, mortal friends. And they each have a story they tell him, and the story is about, how I came to know you. They're all kind of point of meeting stories. How did you come into my life? And they're the not to fill in his gaps so much as to recalibrate the ideas about himself he wants to keep. So it was a way of having backstory, but having backstory that also involved kind of, over the course of the book, describing what he needs out of relationships. And since he's forming a very strong friendship with the heroine, that's kind of a live question.
And just to go into that fairy world that you just mentioned, the she, which in the Absolute book is such an astonishingly beautiful place. It's the kind of place you want to go to and stay in for some time. Yeah. But you really kind of look at the problem of the idea of utopias in the novel. And you really do start to engage strongly with the current environmental crisis without giving any spoilers away. And I wondered if in your current writing, in your next projects, if you are also working into current political issues and the current environmental crisis.
Sort of sidelong. The book I've just finished, which is a kind of another book among the Southland books, like Dream Hunter and Dreamquake and Mortal Fire. The young people in the book learn that they can't rely on the older people to look after them, and which is kind of a standard story, but it's less about being surrounded by, the adult villains or the adults who've just disappeared, but being surrounded by people who don't have enough will to realise when something's a crisis. And it's not specifically about any particular crisis, but it's about, I guess I'm kind of aiming it at the Zoomers, like, okay, just you might have to be a bit more fierce. Yeah, it's kind of the message in the story.
Absolutely. And to kind of go from there into perhaps a broader discussion about what it is to be a New Zealand writer, I really love the way you talk about it as expanding the definition of what that could be. And I wondered if you could tell us about the landscape of New Zealand writing, the difference between when you first started and where you find yourself now, whether there's been a big change.
It's very hard to tell when you've been writing for a long time how much of your feelings about the difference have to do with your feelings about your own youth as compared to, late middle age where I am now. So, bearing that in mind, I've seen whole waves of different possibilities for New Zealanders, both opening up and then closing down, and then opening up and then closing down. And so when people ask me to give advice, I guess patience is the best advice, because they're going to change the rules on you, or the rules are going to change on you. The idea about what's possible is going to change on you. But what we're always up against is a kind of one of the great invisible isms of the world, which is, I don't know what to call it, hemispherism. I mean, there's always these best 50-something book lists that come out all over the place, historical ones and so forth, and I'm just constantly feel very cynical about the lack of Southern Hemisphere works on any of those. I mean, it's like the Southern Hemisphere's kind of yeah. So being a New Zealand writer, part of being a New Zealand writer is that you're kind of, waving furiously from a place where no one's really looking.
Which is kind of interesting right now, because I feel like the world has looked at New Zealand because of a pandemic, but hopefully they're looking at our books too. That would be great. So on the advice question, you're one of our greatest world builders, and I wondered what you would say would be the rules of world building. Like how do you begin to craft a whole other place that will live in somebody's imagination?
Well, when I teach it, and you will know because you've done my class, it's basically that you have an idea and then you interrogate the idea, and you usually do it as you're writing, but there are things that you need to establish. You need to be able to see what you need to do. So, for instance, if I take Dream Hunter and Dreamquake, there is a place where people can go, and if they sleep in this place, the few people who can go there, they have dreams that are more vivid than dreams in everyday life. And then when they come back to the world, if they go to sleep somewhere, everybody around them who's sleeping shares that dream. Now, that's the sort of basic premise. And my point where it became a live idea for a novel was thinking, well, if this was true, wouldn't it have commercial possibilities? And if it had commercial possibilities, wouldn't it become an industry? Wouldn't there be large hotel-cum theatres where people went to sleep and shared dreams? And then you think, well, if it's an industry, it has a regulatory body. And that means that it has a kind of a political dimension. And if there are dreams, maybe there are also nightmares. And what would a government do with nightmares? Who would they direct those at? So it's kind of a series of going, what if, what if, what if? And actually, but thinking about the world as you do it, thinking about the world that you understand, history as you understand it. And an example would be, from a class of mine, we had a large space station that had been floating in the void for a long time, and they wanted to have a very divided society. So they wanted to have, these rich people, and so they started designing these luxury shops these rich people went to, and I said, okay, so this is a small population. Wouldn't this be artisanal? Wouldn't the wealthy people have tailors and so forth? Because luxury item market is about consumer capitalism. So it's that thing where you go, yes, but, and for that you need to keep prodding at the thing that you've invented, but you also need a really good understanding of the world. So
wow.
Yeah.
So
the real world.
Do you have, say, one or two novels that you would recommend to someone who wanted to embark on building a world, other than your own, other than the Absolute Book?
Oh, depends on what kind of world. I mean, for sheer astonishing volume of invention, you can't go past China Mayville. He's just amazing. But then for the peculiarity of sort of atmosphere and moral intention, I'm really interested in Victor LaValle, the American horror writer. He's an amazing writer. But of course, above everyone, Ursula Le Guin, because she's she's the daughter of anthropologists, and it shows in her science fiction and fantasy. She really understands how things would work for people in the society. There's no sense that her invention is in any way mechanical. It always feels profoundly organic and humane, and so she's my writing hero.
And I can see our clock ticking, but I wanted to ask another question. I've read that in an interview that you described the writing of the Absolute book as writing yourself back into happiness. And I just wondered if that's where a lot of your writing begins from, or if you quite often write from different states of being and feeling.
The book immediately preceding the Absolute book was Wake, and Wake is a horror novel, a very New Zealand horror novel, and the thing I was interested in is how you can look after people when there are increasingly fewer and fewer things you can do for them. And I wrote it while my mother had motor neurone disease and was slowly fading away. So it was a question that was inside me. How can you look after people when there's less and less you can do? Coming out of that time, which was so difficult, I just had this amazing feeling of lightness, like when you walk away from the tragic things that have happened, the difficult things, but you walk away with the changes they've made inside you. So that's why Taryn has sort of Taryn, the heroine of the Absolute book, has a broken life, and then she basically walks away into fairyland and into this enormous freedom and beauty, and also engagement with life and eventually with herself again. And that was just coming out of my own feeling of coming back to life. So yeah, those books are related, and they were written out of different needs. But I mean, at the moment, I'm kind of thinking about what readers would like and need, as well as what I want to spend my time doing. So I've got some plans for books that are sort of joyful, or intriguing, romantic, very diverting, because I feel that we need these things. And it feels like a good thing to be giving people.
That's very exciting to hear. I can't wait. Thank you so much. I have so many more questions to ask you, but we've run out of time. But I just want to say to everyone that they must read the Absolute book. It is one of those rare novels that you really do just want to start from the start again immediately as you've finished it. It's one of my absolute favourite books. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the novel and all of your other incredible stories. And I encourage the Northern Hemisphere to dive in.